I recall sitting in a university coffee shop across from a young libertarian academic. He was impeccably dressed, very articulate, and he had a copy of Ludwig von Mises' Human Action just sitting on the table, like a holy scripture. He spoke with this seductive, almost clinical confidence about praxeology, this idea that economics is a system of pure, deductive logic, totally immune to the messy contradictions of real-world data. To him, it was a majestic system. If you disagreed, you weren't just having a different opinion, you were, logically illiterate. It felt incredibly clean, this airtight world where every market failure was just a government sin in disguise. But then the conversation drifted. We went from interest rates to culture, and that veneer of high-minded philosophy just cracked. He casually mentioned that true liberalism is wasted on certain demographics, and he quoted Mises directly, smirking about the hopelessness of nations that worship cows and monkeys. Then, channeling his inner Hans Hermann Hoppe, he argued that a truly free society actually requires the right to physically expel dissidents and those with non-traditional lifestyles. The shift was jarring. In the span of 2 minutes, he went from preaching universal human freedom to advocating for a gated community enforced by private police. It made me realize something unsettled about this specific brand of ideology. The certainty he felt wasn't derived from a love of liberty. It was a rigid dogma used to intellectualize exclusion. And looking at the history of Mises and his successors, you start to see that this wasn't a bug in the system, it was the feature. So that story really sets our mission for this deep dive. We need to unpack this ideological framework that starts with this premise of universal liberty, but then it evolves to allow for profound, often cultural exclusion. We're going to analyze why this specific reliance on certainty, this thing derived from pure deductive logic, struggles so dramatically when it's faced with the messy, complex reality of modern capitalism and, practical governance.
And you're hitting on the core tension right away. Mises' ideas, and really the whole foundation of the Austrian school, they were forged explicitly in the tumultuous political landscape of the early 20th century. They were responding directly to the rising tides of Nazism, fascism, and communism.
So it was a reaction.
A very strong reaction. Mises was looking for an intellectual bedrock, an unfettered market that was so logically pure it could withstand any totalitarian assault. He saw this rigorous, non-empirical defense as the ultimate bulwark against state tyranny.
It sounds like a philosophical act of self-defense. They needed a system that wasn't reliant on the shifting sands of public opinion or, government statistics, because in that era, the state controlled the narrative and the data.
Exactly. That historical imperative fueled his decision to completely reject the prevailing methodological approach. At the time, that was the German historical school, which focused heavily on empirical observation, historical analysis, and localized institutional studies.
So they were looking at what was happening on the ground.
Right. And for the Austrians, particularly Mises, empirical analysis wasn't just incomplete, it was dangerous. He thought it provided ammunition for those who believed the economy was just a sociological construct that could be, centrally manipulated.
So if the historical school said economics should be kind of like history and psychology, prioritizing what has happened, the Austrians essentially said, no. We are going to build our economic system based on pure theoretical deduction, prioritizing what must be logically true.
And that right there is the origin of praxeology.
Okay, so let's start there. This airtight world of praxeology and its main weapon, the economic calculation problem.
Praxeology asserts that economic theory is a field of, a priori truth, meaning it's known independent of experience. It begins and ends with a fundamental, self-evident axiom. The action axiom,
which is
simply that individuals always act intentionally to achieve desired ends. That's it.
And their definition of action is simple, right? Moving from a state they find less desirable to a state they find more desirable, and they use the minimum cost time, effort, or unpleasantness to get there.
That's the entire mechanism. And crucially, Misesian praxeology defines rational in a highly specific, stripped-down way. When they say an individual acts rationally, they just mean the action is intentional. It's directed toward a desired end.
They're not judging the action.
Not at all. They're not assessing whether the end itself is wise or moral or if it will work in the long term. The wisdom or efficacy of the action is completely irrelevant to the theory of action itself.
Okay, let's unpack the central critique here, because this is where the deductive fortress is really built. Critics argue this core axiom, humans act intentionally to achieve desired ends. It only becomes self-evident within the closed, abstract scheme of praxeology itself.
That's the core vulnerability. It creates a complete logical circle.
How so?
Within this system, A human is defined as an entity that performs intentional acts. An intentional act is defined as what humans do to achieve a desired end. The statements are mutually and exclusively defining.
It's circular logic.
It is, and this ensures the axiom is logically pure and undeniable, but it deliberately resists any attempt to introduce external, messy data.
So if you try to use statistics or psychological studies to measure happiness or preference,
The Misesian response is essentially that data is irrelevant to the logical truth of the axiom.
why were they so afraid of data?
Precisely. Mises feared that quantitative methods and statistics produced a false impression of a physics-grade science where none could exist in human affairs. If you try to quantify utility, you're suggesting that human action is predictable and measurable like a physical phenomenon.
And that opens the door for.
For the central planners, Mises saw this as giving intellectual cover to the people who claim they can measure and direct societal outcomes scientifically. So the deductive purity of praxeology is a methodological choice. It's designed specifically to protect the theory from the political abuse Mises was seeing all over Europe.
The ultimate rigidity. And the price of maintaining that logical purity is the absolute rejection of the empirical world.
It has to be.
So that foundation of deductive logic, it leads directly to Mises's most influential practical critique, the economic calculation problem, or ECP. He first argued this back in 1920. This was his decisive blow against centralized planning. What's the fundamental nature of the problem he identified?
The ECP addresses the fundamental impossibility of rational planning in any economy that lacks a market-derived price system for capital goods. The essential issue is the heterogeneity of capital and labor.
Meaning everything is different?
Exactly. Factories, machinery, tools, raw materials, skilled labor, they're all vastly different. One machine might be capable of 100 different tasks. One type of steel might require a specific refining process.
Right. You can't compare a tractor to a computer chip or a machinist's time to an accountant's time just based on their physical output or the hours they worked.
You can't. And rational economic activity requires determining which ends are most urgent for consumers and which means are the least costly to achieve them. To make that comparison, you need a common denominator, a universal basis for comparison across all these diverse forms of capital and labor.
And this is where the market price system, denominated in money, becomes essential.
Yes, money acts as that common unit. The exchange of consumer goods establishes prices that represent the marginal utility, the additional satisfaction consumers expect to receive.
Okay, so that's for things we buy. What about the means of production?
When money is also used for capital goods and labor, an entrepreneur can compare the marginal cost of producing a good using one input versus another. They can rationally decide whether to invest in a new automated machine, which is expensive capital, or hire more manual labor, which means wage costs.
And without that price mechanism,
that essential comparative function is gone. The whole thing falls apart.
this directly refutes the Marxist labor theory of value, which proposed that the amount of labor in a good could be its standard measure.
It was a direct intellectual conflict. Mises argued that relying on labor content fails entirely because labor itself is heterogeneous. An hour of an engineer's time is vastly different from an hour of unskilled labor. It's just not comparable.
And value isn't just about the past.
Right. The value of capital isn't determined by past labor input, but by the future expected demand of consumers. Only a fluid, market-derived price mechanism can capture those forward-looking, subjective valuations. In a centrally planned socialist system, the planners are essentially flying blind.
They have no reliable signals.
None. No signals to tell them if they are using scarce, non-reproducible resources efficiently or simply wasting them.
The outcome, as Mises saw it, wasn't just inefficiency. It was chaos. A steady depletion of capital goods because nobody could rationally account for their scarcity or their alternative uses.
Total chaos, a planned chaos, as he called it. So, building on the ECP, Mises and his followers detailed specific market conditions that are not optional. They are absolutely essential prerequisites for any economy to act rationally.
Okay, let's review them, starting with the obvious one.
First, the universal use of money and prices. This has to include the valuation of capital goods. If a planner substitutes calculation in kind, measuring inputs by physical amounts like tons of steel or barrels of oil for calculation in money, they lose the ability to compare any two projects.
So even if the government controls all the inputs, if they aren't priced competitively, they might choose to build a giant bridge when they should have built 1,000 small roads, just because they lacked the comparative cost data.
That's a perfect example. The second prerequisite is entrepreneurship. The market needs dynamism. It can't be static.
This is where people like Israel Kirzner come in.
Yes. Kirzner really elaborated on this, emphasizing the role of the entrepreneur's alertness. The entrepreneur isn't just a risk taker, but someone who is constantly discovering opportunities and correcting errors.
So they see a need and fill it.
Right. Entrepreneurs reap profits by supplying unfulfilled needs, guiding production planning, and adjusting prices toward marginal costs. This market rivalry forces prices to become more accurate representations of consumer marginal utility. If you remove that profit and loss feedback mechanism, you remove the force that constantly improves price signals.
But the greatest conceptual leap, I think, is the necessity of financial markets going beyond just the immediate spot market.
Absolutely. The third condition is robust financial markets. The economy isn't static, it's perpetually subjected to change, technological innovation, and shifting consumer tastes.
So capital can't just sit there.
It has to move. It must be continuously withdrawn from unprofitable ventures and applied to more profitable ones. Mises argued that this function is only accomplished by capitalists who buy and sell stocks, shares, and futures, who make loans, and who speculate. Financial markets are the mechanism through which forecasts of future consumer demand are tested.
This means that even if a central planner could somehow perfectly price today's inventory, they'd still lack the decentralized, forward-looking mechanism of financial speculation needed to decide which new technologies or infrastructure projects to fund tomorrow.
That is the core point. The trial and error process in financial markets ensures that entrepreneurs who make bad forecasts of future consumer demand incur losses, which removes capital from their hands. A socialist system, lacking this rigorous financial calculation, has no objective means to prevent capital from being wasted on long-term projects that are doomed to fail or those which consumers ultimately don't value.
Okay, the logical case against central planning is powerful, I get it. But we have to introduce some friction here. If the ECP provides this logical, absolute certainty, why did prominent economists, people like Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner in the mid-20th century, believe they could solve it?
The famous market socialism debate.
Yes.
Lange and Lerner proposed that a socialist system could, in effect, mimic the function of the market.
How would that even work?
They suggested that central planners could use a trial and error approach. The planners would simply set prices for capital goods and resources, like a state-run shadow pricing system, and then just observe inventory changes.
So if a price led to shortages, they'd raise it. If it led to surpluses, they'd lower it.
That was the idea, a kind of thermostat model.
What was Mises and Hayek's rebuttal to this attempt to compromise?
Well, their rebuttal was multifaceted and, frankly, devastating. First, they argued that this method still required real competitive entrepreneurship, not just managerial obedience to state rules to drive the correction process. You need that human alertness.
And the second point?
Secondly, and more fundamentally, Mises argued that setting prices by trial and error would be impossibly slow in a complex dynamic economy. By the time the planners registered a shortage, adjusted the price, and then registered the new results, all the underlying conditions, technologies, preferences, global trade would have shifted again.
So they'd always be miles behind the curve.
Always. They were simulating a market, but without the speed, the incentive, and the vast dispersed knowledge that a real competitive market provides. It was a pale imitation.
Now let's jump ahead a few decades. Today we have big data and AI. We see massive corporations like Walmart and Amazon using sophisticated algorithms to manage global supply chains. Doesn't that suggest the calculation problem is, if not solved, at least highly mitigated?
It suggests mitigation for sure, but not resolution. And this is a really critical distinction that gets into the technical detail. The contemporary argument from figures like Leigh Phillips is that since firms like Amazon are these massive internally planned hierarchies, the ECP is theoretically surmountable.
But the key rebuttal is that Amazon still exists within a market context. It's not the whole economy.
Exactly. Amazon can calculate its profitability because it relies on external competitive market prices for its raw materials, its capital goods, and the cost of capital itself.
So it's using the signals from the wider market to do its internal planning.
Right. If Amazon were suddenly mandated to operate in a nationalized, non-market environment without external price signals to value a new server farm or a fleet of trucks, their sophisticated internal planning would instantly collapse. Their internal planning efficiency is a consequence of, not a substitute for, the market mechanism.
And this leads us to the most sophisticated modern challenge: the limits of AI and data itself. Why can't advanced AI serve as the central planner? You mentioned the issue of ordinal versus cardinal utility. We need to go into depth on this because it's the technical hinge point.
This is the critical theoretical block that technology simply cannot overcome. Economic calculation requires not just knowing what people do, but assigning a comparable cardinal, so a numerical value to their satisfaction level to determine optimal resource allocation.
Okay, break that down. Ordinal versus cardinal.
Ordinal preferences are what we know. I prefer coffee to tea. That's a ranking. A is greater than B. Cardinal utility requires a number. I value coffee by 50 units of utility and tea by 20 units.
And the AI, even with all the data in the world, it can observe your past purchases and deduce that you prefer coffee, but it can't assign a common universal unit of utility that allows it to compare your need for coffee against another person's need for, say, a specialized medication.
That's it. You've got it. Economic calculation must compare the satisfaction yielded by every conceivable good across millions of individuals to rationally price and allocate resources.
And you can't just ask people.
Since utility is subjective, forward-looking, and non-commensurate meaning, you can't convert one person's feeling of satisfaction into another person's AI, simply cannot derive the numerical cardinal values needed for optimal pricing. And there's another problem.
Okay.
AI relies on big data, which is inherently based on past information. Rational planning requires accurate forecasting of future preferences, which are constantly created and changed by technology and cultural shifts. The system remains logically pure, but empirically disconnected from the future. It's always looking in the rearview mirror. To understand the mutation we talked about in the intro, we have to recognize the starting point. Classical economic liberalism, the tradition of Adam Smith, was a really optimistic doctrine. It was born of the Enlightenment, founded on the premise that all human beings are born free and equal.
And the market was the tool to achieve that.
The market was seen as the most efficient way to maximize that universal freedom.
But Mises' system, forged in response to totalitarianism, introduced a defensive rigidity that shifted the philosophical goalposts.
It replaced that optimism with a necessary dogmatism. The system became so rigorous, so deductively airtight, that it couldn't be challenged by external facts. This rigidity was most obvious in its embrace of negative freedom.
The freedom from things.
Exactly. The definition of freedom solely as the absence of external constraint or interference.
Why is that reliance on negative freedom so critical to the Misesian system?
Because admitting the concept of positive freedom, the freedom to attain fundamental human needs rooted in goodness and justice, like health or literacy, would require the state to actively intervene.
It would require the government to do something.
It would require them to redistribute resources and impose cooperative social policies. This would instantly introduce messy, empirical questions about justice and equity, which would break the axiomatic purity of praxeology. The obsession with negative freedom wasn't just philosophical, it was a necessary logical consequence of the deductive structure itself.
It sounds like the moment you allow for government intervention, even if it's well-intended, you introduce the non-calculable, non-rational element back into the system, which Mises saw as the path to control.
Precisely. For Mises, the moment the state intervenes, even to correct a perceived injustice or provide a social good, it sets the economy on the path to inevitable authoritarianism. He saw this slippery slope as absolute.
And this is a huge break from someone like Adam Smith.
A massive break. This contrasts sharply with classical liberal founders. Adam Smith, for instance, explicitly wrote that the wise and virtuous man is willing that his own private interest should be sacrificed to the public interest. This notion of civic virtue and sacrificing private gain for public interest is just. It's irreconcilable with the later radical libertarian emphasis on unfettered self-interest as the only rational motive.
Mises' fear was not just economic failure, but totalitarianism, which he associated with any state-directed positive action, linking it to dark phrases like the one the Nazis used, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free.
Correct. The state, to him, always operates under the pretense of goodness, but its methods are coercive and inevitably lead to loss of freedom. The market, even in its tyranny, is merely the consequence of individual actions. The state's tyranny is imposed through violence and coercion. That was the line in the sand for him. So the stage was set. Mises provided the deductive tools, but it was Murray Rothbard who applied this deductive methodology beyond economics into ethics and law, creating a complete, unified moral science. Libertarianism.
Rothbard truly was the grand system builder. He's the one who transformed Mises' defense of the market into a comprehensive, axiomatic, deductive political system.
He was highly systematic. He replaced the philosophical eclecticism of someone like Hayek with a rigorous rationalist method that became the intellectual benchmark for modern American libertarianism.
And how did he do that?
He took the logical purity of praxeology and sought to marry it to natural law, particularly property rights, creating a philosophy where every ethical and political truth could be deduced from non-aggression and self-ownership.
And this is where Hans Hermann Hoppe stepped in, providing the logical framework that supports the exclusionary results we heard about earlier.
Hoppe explicitly championed this approach in his work. He argued that rational ethics is possible based on absolute universal principles derived deductively. His key move was the introduction of argumentation ethics.
Okay, what is that?
Hoppe argued that the very act of engaging in rational ethical deliberation presupposes certain rights, namely, the right to property in one's body and one's appropriated land.
Why is that necessary? I don't see the connection.
Because if you are arguing, you must be standing somewhere, using air and using time. These are scarce resources. Hoppe criticized egalitarian theories like John Rawls's for ignoring this general fact of scarcity, even during ethical deliberation.
Rawls' original position behind the veil of ignorance.
Right. It assumes disembodied, non-scarce entities. Hoppe insisted that because real human beings are constrained by scarcity, property rights in their bodies and land must be presupposed for the act of deliberation itself. If you deny those property rights, you're committing what he called a performative contradiction, rendering your argument illogical for real human actors.
So this elevates the defense of private property from an economic utility to an ethical necessity, making egalitarianism not just inefficient, but flat out illogical.
Exactly. And the consequence of this absolute property right is the justification for the controversial exclusionary political doctrines we see emerging from this school of thought. Since property is absolute, the owner has the ultimate right to jurisdiction over their land and who uses it.
Which supports the right to physically expel dissidents, refuse transactions based on lifestyle, or enforce cultural conformity.
The system logically supports the owner's right to refuse transactions, hire or fire anyone they choose, including those with non-traditional lifestyles or political dissidents.
So it's not just about economics anymore.
Not at all. Hoppe argued that if a property owner believes certain conduct is socially destructive, he used the example of abortion, they have the right to use their property rights to raise the cost of that conduct, effectively excluding it from their domain. This is considered positively moral because it uses the logical structure of property rights to enforce cultural and social norms.
So it turns a philosophy about universal freedom into a theoretical apparatus for exclusion and, well, cultural homogeneity.
That's a mutation.
The journey from Mises to Hoppe involves a profound conceptual shift from universalism to nationalism. Mises himself, coming from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was a staunch anti-militarist and a profound universalist.
Mises firmly believed in open borders and free trade globally. He viewed peace as the essential prerequisite for all progress, and that progress was rooted in the international division of labor. The market, for him, encompassed all of mankind. To restrict it nationally was to diminish civilization and invite conflict.
So how on earth did the same intellectual tradition shift to provide justification for restrictionist nationalism?
This shift occurred primarily among Mises' successors, notably Rothbard. He adapted the theory to geopolitical reality, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Rothbard warned specifically against unlimited immigration, arguing that it could be exploited by existing regimes to destroy cultures or achieve political control.
The example of the Soviet Union exporting or importing people to destroy cultures is chillingly specific.
It provided a real-world rationale. Rothbard cited the example of ethnic Russians flooding Estonia and Latvia, undermining the national and cultural identity of those regions.
So the context changed the application of the theory.
Right. He argued that the principle of open borders only works when the government is strictly limited and non-interventionist. In a world of welfare states, mass immigration can be exploited by political forces to change voting patterns or overwhelm existing social infrastructure funded by existing taxpayers.
This tension reveals a profound crisis. The core intellectual commitment shifts from these abstract, universal principles of economic freedom to a fear of national dissolution and identity politics.
The result is the theoretical apparatus that supports protectionism and immigration restriction, the two economic pillars of modern populist nationalism, often associated with, say, Trumpism. The system becomes less about defending an abstract global market and more about protecting a specific national, cultural, and political hegemony from dilution.
And that provides a logical bridge for highly rigid libertarians to align with populist movements they once theoretically opposed.
It's a very strange intellectual bedfellowship, but the logic holds within their system. So when we compare the Misesian ideal, this perfect, rationally calculating system, with the observed phenomena of advanced economies, we see why critics argue the model was constructed on the basis of fear. It just refuses to recognize factual information that contradicts its normative outcomes.
The failure always comes down to the model's reliance on unrealistic assumptions. Right. Perfect information, perfect rationality, and perfect internalization of costs.
Precisely. In the deductive fortress, the price of a product must always reflect its true scarcity and cost. But in reality, unregulated markets fail constantly due to complex real-world phenomena.
Let's start with the cost calculation failures, the negative externalities.
In an unregulated environment, corporations find it rational to externalize costs-dumping pollution, using cheap, dangerous labor overseas, or degrading shared infrastructure. The price of their product reflects only the cost of production, not the downstream social, health, and environmental costs borne by unrelated third parties.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A coal power plant's electricity price reflects the cost of mining the coal and running the generators, but it fails to account for the respiratory illnesses of the local population or the long-term climate costs. The market is failing to communicate the true scarcity and cost of the resource use.
This is compounded by the problem of asymmetrical information. The assumption of perfect knowledge is almost absurd in a complex industrial state.
It is entirely absurd. Asymmetrical information, where one party in a transaction knows significantly more than the other, is the norm, not the exception. The tobacco industry concealed cancer risks for decades. Corporations conceal pollution data.
This wasn't accidental.
Not at all. It was a rational, self-interested decision to maintain profitability by withholding information. The libertarian model assumed that consumers would simply price the risk correctly. But when the risk is concealed, the market cannot perform its calculation function, leading to massive social destruction in the name of private profit. The market, in this case, becomes a weapon wielded by those with superior knowledge.
And the model simply has no mechanism for addressing public and social gaps.
It fundamentally fails here because there's no profit incentive to provide them. Public goods, like national defense or the court system, suffer from the free rider problem. Everyone wants them, but no one wants to pay for them individually.
And social goods.
Social goods, clean air, basic literacy, disease control are essential for a functioning society, but are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Look at developing nations. When tax systems are weak and government capacity is limited, a scenario theoretically favored by radical libertarians, private capital is extracted from things like mining, but the profits aren't reinvested into the public good.
And you're left with?
You're left with vital infrastructure that's crude and dangerous. Only state capacity, funded by taxation, can compel the necessary cooperative investment for those kinds of goods.
So the consequence of unchecked self-interest in an unregulated system is the rational outcome of maximizing private power, leading to what critics call the tyranny of the market.
Precisely. We see lobbying, political donations, price collusion, cartels, and bribery become rational business choices. Far from dispersing power, the unregulated market concentrates wealth and coercive power into the hands of a small percentage of corporations, creating the exact same fear Mises had of tyranny, just delivered by the private sector rather than the public sector.
We can trace this failure from the abstract theory to concrete catastrophic policy failures driven by this ethos of deregulation. Let's look at the California electricity deregulation fiasco in 2001.
This was the perfect test case for the theory of negative freedom. Remove the constraints, and the market will respond with greater efficiency, lower prices, and maximized output. The policy was meant to liberate generators from price caps.
And what happened instead?
The exact opposite.
It was the mechanism of failure.
It was pure fraud and collusion. Corporations like Enron realized they could exploit the deregulation structure. They engaged in deliberate market manipulation, taking power plants offline for maintenance when demand was high, fabricating paper trades to pump up prices, and creating artificial scarcity.
All to drive the price up.
All to drive the price up. This led to what was termed the death spiral, resulting in widespread blackouts and astronomical pricing spikes that ravaged the state economy. The theoretical model of maximizing production and falling prices failed entirely because the profit motive was channeled into manipulation and fraud, not competitive efficiency.
And perhaps the most complex and damaging failure was the 2008 banking crisis. This resulted directly from the removal of constraints designed to promote prudence.
The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999 was the key theoretical turning point. Glass-Steagall had separated risk-averse retail banking, where you keep your savings, from high-risk investment banking, which is speculation.
And its repeal, justified by the idea of maximizing market freedom.
It removed the necessary constraints, allowing profit motives to drive reckless, speculative decisions.
And this led to a massive problem of moral hazard. Explain that mechanism in the context of 2008.
Moral hazard is the danger that one party will take undue risks because the costs of those risks will be borne by another party. The banks knew they were too big to fail. They packaged highly risky subprime mortgages into complex instruments like collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, and credit default swaps, CDSs.
CDSs, for our listeners, were essentially insurance policies against default, but sold to entities that didn't even own the underlying mortgages.
Exactly. They turned financial risk into a casino. Banks pursued this high-risk strategy because they knew that if the market went up, they collected astronomical profits. If the market collapsed, which it did, the government would be forced to bail them out using taxpayer money to prevent global systemic collapse.
So there was no downside for them.
Very little. This moral hazard, the expectation of a safety net, incentivized destructive, unregulated self-interest, leading directly to bank failures, massive wealth concentration, and widespread unemployment and foreclosures. It demonstrated unequivocally that the pursuit of self-interest in an unregulated system is often profoundly detrimental to the public good, regardless of the theoretical purity of the system.
Misesian theory, as we noted, had a preemptive defense against two common critiques of capitalism: monopolies and large-scale bureaucracy. Let's start with monopolies.
Misesian theory maintains that monopolies are not a natural outcome of the free market. They claim they are generally the result of government intervention, either through outright franchises or privileges granted by the state, like patents or licensing requirements, or through control over finite natural resources, like a unique mining deposit.
So if a company like Amazon dominates a market, Mises would argue that this dominance is temporary because high profits will inevitably attract competition that will quickly dissipate its power.
Precisely. They argue that monopolies in manufacturing are fleeting. In a truly free market, the moment a company achieves a position of high profit, new competitors, driven by that entrepreneurial impulse, will flood the market and restore efficiency and lower prices. Therefore, any persistent monopoly is a sign of state interference, not market failure.
Okay, what about bureaucratization? It seems undeniable that large private corporations have massive, rigid bureaucracies. How does Mises address that critique?
Mises argued that private enterprises, no matter how large, remain fundamentally non-bureaucratic as long as they adhere strictly and solely to profit calculation.
The bottom line.
The bottom line. The ability to calculate profit and loss provides a clear, objective measure of performance and merit for every department and manager. If a division is losing money, it is objectively failing. This external constraint forces efficiency.
And that objective measure is the difference between private enterprise and public administration.
Yes. Public administration, lacking the objective yardstick of profit, must rely on fixed, obligatory instructions and political factors for guidance. Mises then argues that the bureaucracy we do observe in private businesses today is a direct result of interventionism.
He blames the government again.
Every time. When a large private firm is forced to deviate from pure profit calculation, say, to comply with complex, overlapping regulations, or to avoid government harassment, or to cater to political prejudice, it is forced to become bureaucratized. The inefficiency is thus a symptom of the state's interference, not a natural outcome of large-scale capitalism.
This inherent distrust of any middle ground leads to the no middle way doctrine. This is the argument that interventionism isn't just unwise, but fundamentally impractical and self-defeating.
It's the ultimate logical threat in the Misesian system. He argued that any attempt to strike a compromise between pure capitalism and pure socialism, like implementing regulated markets, price fixing, or targeted subsidies, is inherently unstable.
Let's follow that slippery slope. Why is an attempt to fix prices, for example, doomed to escalate?
Okay, take rent control. The government fixes rent below the market rate to help tenants. Rational economic actors, landlords, and developers immediately respond by reducing maintenance and stopping the construction of new housing because the profit incentive is gone.
So you get a housing shortage.
Right. And to address that shortage, the government must then introduce rationing and compulsory measures. But eventually, construction just halts completely. To prevent this, the government must control the prices of all the inputs, construction labor, materials, cement, and extend control over the entire supply chain.
So a localized intervention, intended to promote fairness, logically forces the state to expand control indefinitely until the entire economy is subjected to authoritarian decree.
Exactly. Mises concluded that this series of events proves that interventionism is inherently impracticable. It can never achieve its desired goals without causing massive unintended distortions that demand further, more extensive intervention. The choice, therefore, is not between a mixed economy and a free one, but between capitalism and socialism. There is no stable, functioning middle ground. This brings us to the profound irony and disappointment felt by many intellectual purists. The practical failure of the philosophical movement to adapt to modern crises, what has been called the noble betrayal. The rigidity of the theory made the political movement brittle.
Where did this intellectual tradition fail to cope with the contemporary political landscape?
It became internally squeezed. The intellectual center, dedicated to expanding universal freedom through markets, was eroded by the rise of protectionist nationalism on the right and social democratic impulses on the left.
And the theory couldn't handle it.
The highly abstract theory was ill-equipped to diagnose the concrete rise of corporatism, the fusion of state and corporate power, which didn't fit neatly into the socialism or capitalism binary.
And this alienation was compounded by the institutionalization of the philosophy itself, what you call the professionalization of activism.
It was a systemic shift. The institutionalization, the creation of think tanks, academic chairs, and policy organizations turned intellectual advocacy into a career path. And the first priority for professionals became securing employment and climbing the corporate ladder, which fostered massive institutional risk aversion. They had to maintain their funding base and avoid political controversy.
Can you provide some specific examples of how this risk aversion manifested during modern crises?
When major events occurred, say the 2008 bank bailouts, prolonged foreign wars, or the government-mandated COVID lockdowns, the organized movement often remained silent or offered these lukewarm theoretical critiques that avoided rocking the boat.
So they pulled their punches.
Completely. A truly radicalization approach should have demanded the collapse of the banks to purge the bad investments and oppose the lockdowns as massive state overreach. Instead, many institutions chose professional perpetuity over intellectual purity, ignoring or permitting policies that fundamentally contradicted the core anti-interventionist doctrine just to maintain political access and funding.
So the organizations designed to champion pure, non-bureaucratic freedom became large, risk-averse bureaucracies themselves, existing primarily to perpetuate their own funding base.
That's the deepest betrayal. This resulted in a replacement of rigorous theoretical engagement with a kind of smug, simplistic certainty. Instead of providing meaningful solutions to crises like the fusion of corporate and state power, the corporatist hegemon, they continue to repeat simplistic dogma. Taxation is theft. Deregulation solves everything.
And that just pushes people away.
This rigidity alienated intellectuals seeking nuance and practical solutions, leaving the movement politically sidelined and unable to meaningfully contest the complex regulatory environment we live in.
So we are left with this stark dichotomy. On one side, you have the belief in a perfect, rational, logical system, claiming that only capitalism can support the global population at a high standard of living. On the other, the observed reality of market failures and the ideology's political mutation into a rigid vehicle for exclusion.
Mises' central contention that without economic calculation, production would decrease so enormously that civilization would collapse. That remains a profound, historically validated insight into the necessity of price signals. The tyranny of the market, though harsh, is preferable to the tyranny of the state, in Mises' view.
But the axiomatic approach failed to prepare the ideology for a world where interventionism didn't just lead to outright socialism, but to corporatism, and where the unchecked pursuit of self-interest in an unregulated system consistently concentrates coercive power, leading to the tyranny of the private sector.
The problem with prioritizing logical purity above all else is that it inherently closes the system off to external correction. It assumed perfect efficiency, and when faced with systemic crises like the 2008 crash, it instinctively preferred to blame government intervention every single time, rather than admitting the possibility of inherent flaws like asymmetrical information or moral hazard that arise even in the absence of government. The deep certainty derived from praxeology provided a powerful intellectual mechanism but created a deductive fortress. By prioritizing logical purity and rejecting the complexity of empirical reality, the ideology ultimately struggled to recognize that the greatest threat to human flourishing is not defined solely by overt government coercion, but also by the relentless, exclusionary concentration of wealth and coercive power that an unfettered market, ironically, rationally produces.
The intellectual history of this tradition reveals a profound lesson. That when a philosophy about universal freedom becomes so rigid that it cannot admit contradictory data or adapt to human complexity, the pursuit of absolute logical purity can inadvertently become the intellectual scaffolding for the very forces of power, exclusion, and institutional rigidity it originally sought to dismantle.